All right, so we have covered two of the larger categories of true fungi, your Ascomycetes and your Basidiomycetes. Now, Oomycetes were often considered fungi back when we were starting to categorize these, but they are not actually true fungi. So these are more closely related to red algae, whereas your Ascomycetes and Basidiomycetes are more closely related to insects. Okay, so if you were to look at a phylogenetic tree, they would actually fall very far away from each other, but they have a lot of the same structures. Okay, so Oomycetes still have hypha, mycelium, and thalli, all right? But they have some things that do differ. For example, where the true fungi have septate hypha, Oomycetes hypha are aseptate, which means that there are no cross walls. All of the nuclei just flow inside of the tube as they're going, okay? And that's something that if you were to come across them in a field and you were to take a hand lens, you could probably distinguish whether something was a true fungi or an oomycete, which really makes a difference if you're trying to put a fungicide out on your field or on your turf or wherever it is that you're trying to spray your fungicide, okay? Because different fungicides will be used for these two very different types of organisms, even though they look the same, right? A fungicide that is specified for a true fungi will not work on an oomycete. So it's very important to be able to differentiate them. The other thing that you need to be concerned about with the oomycetes is that they actually produce spores that can swim. So oomycetes create a structure that's very similar to that of the conidiophore, okay? This is the sporangiophore. I know, so different, so creative. All right, so you have the sporangiophore, and on top of the sporangiophore, you're going to have these, sometimes they're teardrop shaped, sometimes they're round, but this is the sporangium, okay? And the sporangium is going to serve as an incubator that's going to produce zoospores. And yes, zoospores, again, we're not very creative, right? Zoospores are just a Z in front of it, okay? So these are going to be asexual spores, and they swim, right? So they have flagella on them. These spores are what give the oomycetes their nickname, okay? These are the water molds. The logic behind the Z is that when you were looking at these under a microscope, and you have to think back from the perspective of somebody who doesn't have the internet, who doesn't have the plethora of information that we have before us, they were looking under the microscope thinking they were seeing little animals, okay? Because they were swimming around. Now, zoospores, okay, they use chemotaxis in order to get to the roots. So in other words, if you have a root that's in the soil, it produces root exudates, which are just chemicals that are that it just exudes naturally. These guys can sense, so often it's called smell, okay, even though it's not really smelling, but they can sense those chemicals and they're attracted and they'll swim right to the roots where they'll encyst and infect using that penetration peg, just like we were talking about in the very first one of these videos, okay? So they'll use themselves as an aprosorium, even though they're not going to produce another one, okay? And they'll make the penetration peg and get inside of the plant. Now, oomycetes also do have sexual structures, okay? So they have what are known as the oogonium, which we're just going to draw as a circle. Okay, the oogonium. And then they have the antheridium, which I'm going to try and draw here as more of a I guess a kidney-shaped thing, right? Now, fungi do not have male and female, okay? But if you're going to think of anything as male and female, it would be the Oogonium is female, Antheridium is the male, okay? Because all of the genetic material is going to come in from the Antheridium into the Oogonium, and then eventually this Oogonium is going to have a very thick cell wall that forms, and it's going to turn into what's known as the oospore. That's going to be your survival structure. That's going to be the sexual spore, just like ascospore, basidiospore, oospore. All of those are your sexual spores for these fungi and fungal-like organisms. The other thing that you need to be cautious about when you're talking about oomycetes in general is that a lot of things can serve as the inoculum. Right? So with the ascomycetes and the deuteromycetes and the basidiomycetes, it's mostly going to be the spores that serve as the inoculum. Every once in a while, hypha. Okay? For the oomycetes, the zoospores can be inoculum. The sporangia can be inoculum. The oospores can be inoculum. And yes, even sometimes hypha can serve as the inoculum. So when you're trying to manage these diseases, or at least talk to somebody about how they're planning on managing it, you have to think about, all right, which organism am I looking at? And there could be multiple structures even within that organism that can serve as my inoculum. These are going to mostly be soil-borne pathogens that are going to thrive when there's lots and lots of water. Again, the term water molds, and the fact that they can swim, especially when there is water. So when there are very, very wet springs, that's when you're going to start to have problems with your oomycetes and you have flooding in your fields.